Welcome to your County Lines and Gangs Awareness for Parents session, brought to you by Solucious Equinox. My name is Phil Church and I shall be your narrator and guide for this session. Advertise your business or services within our learning videos. Target advertising to our learners. Please contact our team for prices at info@soluciousequinox.com. This presentation is brought to you by Solucious Equinox Training Solutions and our SETS channel for online learning available on YouTube. Like and subscribe for more videos. So the agenda for today. After some introductions, the session will be on County Lines and Gangs Awareness for Parents. But we were founded in 2018 after my co-director and I left the police earlier in 2018 after 22 years and 15 years police service. And these are just some of the companies and partners that my co-director Jason Hunt and I have had the privilege of working with since then. And these are the police services that we worked for, and whilst in the British Transport Police we were recruit trainers, training and teaching new recruit police officers and transferees for 5 years. Would you like to learn more about our services and products? If you do, please contact us at info@soluciousequinox.com. So the aim of this presentation is to raise awareness of county lines and gangs for parents. So within it we will cover some topics such as what constitutes a gang, child criminal exploitation by gangs, how gang exploitation affects young people and vulnerable adults, who is vulnerable to gang exploitation, and to understand county lines and gangs activity, and the signs of grooming and exploitation by a gang. An early intervention and prevention. And the government state that we must prevent people from committing serious violence and being drawn into exploitation by building resilience, supporting positive alternatives and providing timely interventions at the teachable moment. And the teachable moment is that moment when a unique high interest situation arises that lends itself to a discussion of a particular topic. And a teachable moment is often best demonstrated when a significant emotional or traumatic event, and the emphasis being on the moment versus the lesson. An example would be after a high-speed motor vehicle accident when the use of a seatbelt has obviously saved a life, or conversely, when the lack of a seatbelt has caused loss of life. And people look back at that moment and the reporting of that as a teachable moment. As parents and guardians, we are naturally concerned for the welfare of our children and young people. Although we know that there are many risks which could affect the welfare of our children and young people, some of these may not be obvious to spot. There is some important information we would like to share with you so that you can spot the signs that your child or young person may be at risk of being groomed into a gang or is becoming involved in county lines. Well, what is a gang? Well, the Centre for Social Justice have utilised the following definition of a gang, and they state that it's a relatively durable, predominantly street-based group of young people who see themselves and are seen by others, and that's really important for them, as a discernible group who engage in a range of criminal activity and violence. They identify with or lay claim over a territory, usually a town, village, postcodes, and they have some form of identifying structural feature. So they will have foot soldiers, generals, sergeants, and a hierarchical structure within, and they are in conflict with other similar gangs. Now, if you look at the myth of gangs versus the reality, you can see some of the issues here surrounding the money, weapons, groups of youth together, open access to sex and fast cars, weapons and money. Drill videos are used in many places to promote or encourage violence. And when you look at it versus the reality, injuries, amputees, the suffocation of freedom of speech, and people can't speak out. Victims find themselves unable to speak out freely for fear of being attacked or worse. The National Crime Agency and the police will be kicking in the doors to make arrests, seizing weapons, drugs. There's injuries, some of them extremely serious, and drug abuse. And in some cases, homelessness and other violent injuries that take place. Now, if you look at the myth versus reality, gang crime is not confined to the stereotypical geographical groups. If you look at the media highlighting of gang crime, there are some significant stereotypical views highlighted by them, and that needs to be addressed. The identified risk factors for serious violence. So the risk factors for them becoming subsumed into the world of county lines and gangs falls back to the individual, the school, the community and the peer groups, and the issues that they've had and problems they've had to deal with within. So taking the individual, they themselves have suffered childhood abuse and neglect in the past. They may have had elements of low self-control and impulsivity. They may have aggression issues. They may suffer with low intelligence. They may have substance use, such as alcohol, drugs. They have a positive attitude towards offending, so there's no fear of them being caught. In fact, there's a thrill of the chase of them being caught. They may be involved in antisocial behaviour, and they themselves may have previously committed offences. They suffer with low self-esteem. They may be already involved in some sort of gang membership. And a head injury is a risk factor for serious violence. Because of the damage that is caused to the brain, it can cause people to become impulsive and potentially open for exploitation. Issues and problems within the school, such as low school performance. They may be bullying others. There may be elements of truancy and repeated school exclusion. Within the community, in urban areas of high crime and local deprivation, and a peer group where they hang around with people who are already delinquent. 63% of young people responding to a survey stated the main reason for carrying a gun or a knife was for protection. And not all groups of youths engaged in antisocial behaviour or criminality are in a gang, and labelling youths as a gang can be harmful and become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the Centre for Social Justice definition of what constitutes a gang is a helpful guide to ascertaining if someone you are interacting with is a member or being exploited or groomed by one. Child criminal exploitation by gangs. Child criminal exploitation is common by gangs involved in county lines and occurs when an individual or group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, control, manipulate, or deceive a child or young person under the age of 18. The victim may have been criminally exploited even if the activity appears consensual. So, for example, in order to carry out certain tasks, they'll be rewarded, such as a pair of new trainers, a new mobile phone, or new clothing or money. They are still being exploited. They're being asked to carry out illegal activities for some form of reward. So it's actually a criminal exploitation. Child criminal exploitation does not always involve physical contact. It can also occur through the use of technology. And messaging services such as TikTok, Instagram, and computer console games such as Fortnite, Call of Duty, Roblox, where there's an element of contact through technology that can be untraceable, the exploitation can occur through this. Criminal exploitation of children is broader than just county lines gangs, and it includes, for instance, children forced to work on cannabis farms or to commit theft or robbery. Now, when I was a police officer, we had a complaint come in from a car servicing centre to say to us that they could smell large quantities of cannabis wafting through into their workshop. And we, after obtaining a warrant to search the arches next door, because it was on a railway arch, once we gained entry, we found a huge cannabis farm growing under hydroponic lights. And the gates and doors were padlocked shut. We found two 14-year-old Vietnamese children working within this, and they had a bucket to urinate and defecate in, some bottles of water, and some cheap sandwiches left on a table. They were brought in to work this cannabis farm. Where did these children come from? Where were their parents or guardians? How did they get here? These children were being exploited to work on this cannabis farm, and they were only 14. The system did not know they existed. We did not know they existed, and we had no idea as to how they gained entry. These children were being forced to work in squalid conditions, feeding these cannabis plants. So how does exploitation by gangs affect young people and vulnerable adults? It affects because it is criminal exploitation of children under the age of 18 and vulnerable adults over the age of 18. And this exploitation is a geographical, widespread form of harm. And exploitation is a typical feature of county lines activity. And it is harm which is relatively little known about or recognised by those best placed to spot its potential victims. It's happening under the noses of the parents and guardians, police officers, social services and health services, and all those that are set out to help these people, including the education sector, and many people are not recognising the signs. And these gang members who are exploiting the vulnerable are knowing and notice the ways that their exploited people are being picked up on. And what they do is they adapt their methods to hide it. And as previously explained, it's still exploitation even if the activities appear consensual. And it may involve force or enticement to gain compliance, and is often accompanied by violence or threats. And it's perpetrated by individuals or groups, all genders, young people and or adults, and it's typified by a form of power imbalance in favour of those exploiting. Age may be the obvious imbalance, but it could include gender, cognitive ability, physical strength, status, and access to economic resources. 88% of police forces have reported gang activity, and 81% of police forces have reported importation of drugs into their areas. 30% of police forces report gangs, being active in their areas who are exporting drugs to other counties. London is the largest area for exporting County Lines activity, followed by Merseyside, and 77% of police forces have reported cuckooing in their areas linked to County Lines gangs. These key factors were the exploitation is often accompanied by some form of exchange, carrying drugs in return for a reward. And this reward can be tangible in the form of cash, drugs or clothing, but it can also be intangible, as a reward in such as a status, a protection or perceived friendship or affection within the gang. And it features an unequal dynamic of power. There's always the person who has a higher power over those who they are willing to exploit. And the reward does not make those being exploited less of a victim. And the victim may be involved due to threats against their family members rather than tangible or intangible rewards. Criminal exploitation is the most common exploitation type within County Lines offending, and both males and female minors are recruited to act as runners within the County Lines criminal business model. Runners carry the most risk within the model as a result of transporting large amounts of cash, drugs and weapons. Both male and female victims are exposed to techniques such as plugging, where drugs are concealed internally for transportation. Children undertake other roles within the County Lines model, including cutting and bagging drugs, collecting debts and cuckooing premises. More generally, victims are criminally exploited in roles outside of drug supply, with intelligence indicating vulnerable victims forced to conduct petty crimes such as shoplifting as well as other forms of theft. Offenders make use of this exploitation to further increase their criminal profits. Cuckooed addresses have been linked to many county lines, with victims of all ages encountered by law enforcement in such properties. Children recruited in the areas in which offenders are based are forced to move in and to live in cuckooed properties in supply areas, often without payment, healthcare or access to food. And essentially a cuckooed premises is where they will move in to a vulnerable person's property and take over the premises and use it for their own purposes, such as dealing drugs or for prostitution or for weapons storage. One particular elderly gentleman whose carer alerted the police stated that she'd asked the question as to who the young lads were when they walked in through his front door while she was changing some wounding dressings on his leg. He said, "That young boy there's my grandson, but I don't know who the others are." It transpired he was not allowed to go upstairs into his own property, and as a result of her making some further inquiries, it turned out they were using upstairs to grow drugs, so they'd completely taken over his premises. In this case study, a male's hand was severed and both his legs were broken. The victim was male, with intelligence supporting that the incident was a drug taxing. The victim is believed to be part of a County Lines network, with the offenders being a local drug line. It is suggested to be a punishment attack by the persons the victim was running drugs for having used the drugs or spent the proceeds himself. So think of some of the incidents that you have dealt with in the past, or may be presented to you in the future. One particular incident with an arrival at a hospital accident and emergency saw a young male who claimed he'd fallen off his bicycle at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the only injury that was sustained were busted kneecaps. Nothing else. No scrapes to his arms, his elbows, his hands, his face where he'd fallen off his bike. Just his kneecaps. What was he doing out at 2 a.m? How was he really injured? An arrival at an A&E saw a young male claiming that he'd fallen on a large mirror and the glass had shattered. Again, the injury that was sustained to himself was a large puncture wound to the abdomen. No cuts to his arms, his legs, anywhere else, scrapes, a large puncture wound to the abdomen. So think of the professional curiosity with yourself for police officers, ambulance staff, hospital and social services. The professional curiosity and the questions that can be asked in these circumstances as to how these injuries were obtained. These people are victims as well as being an offender themselves. So who is vulnerable to gang exploitation? Well, children as young as 12 years old are being exploited or moved by gangs to courier drugs out of their local area. 15 to 16 years is the most common age range, and this is most likely because parents and guardians allowing their children that little bit more freedom, whereas before when they were younger they were kept closely under scrutiny. Males and females are exploited, and white British children are targeted where the gangs perceive that they are more likely to evade police detection, but any ethnicity or nationality may be exploited. These gangs are literally playing into the hands of unconscious bias and a stereotypical approach that is perceived that is acted on by some police officers. Social media is used to make initial contact with children and young people, so be very wary of programmed computer games such as Roblox, Fortnite, Call of Duty, and messaging systems such as Instagram, BlackBerry Messenger, TikTok, and other systems such as that have a messaging that will disappear over time and is encrypted. Class A drug users are targeted so their gangs can take over their homes, and as I discussed earlier on, it's known as cuckooing. County lines are widespread, with gangs known to operate from London, Liverpool, Manchester, and they're known to target vulnerable children and adults. And factors that heighten a person's vulnerability. So there's been elements of prior neglect, physical and or sexual abuse. There could be an economic vulnerability. In some cases where they are literally the breadwinner and the only way they can keep the roof over their head is because of county lines and gangs involvement, because of the money it brings in. There may be homelessness or an insecure accommodation that could cause them to be cuckooed. They may have connections with people associated with gangs. A physical or learning disability can heighten a person's vulnerability because those who are out to exploit can use that vulnerability to exploit them. They may have a mental health or substance misuse. There may be repeated exclusions from mainstream education, and there could be learners in pupil referral units who are mixing with those who are already vulnerable for exploitation. Young persons and children who are recruited by gangs to move drugs between cities often go missing for extended periods of time from home and school. And they'll come back over time. Where have they been? What have they been doing? And why have they left? So these vulnerability factors, the personal factors that they find themselves in, such as perceived difference that they are feeling about themselves, and that difference could be their age. They could find themselves remarkably younger, significantly younger than the person exploiting them, or significantly older than the person exploiting them. Their ethnicity, a difference with their mental health, sexual orientation, their religion, their gender, and disability. These are personal factors that could open up over time to become vulnerability. They can also be a person's strength. If you take the situations that a person finds himself in, this person could already be carrying out risky behaviour, shoplifting, small amounts of drug taking, alcohol. The abuser being present with them. So they're coming into your home, the person who's their friend could actually be their person who's actually the abuser, the person setting out to exploit them. Their situation could be poverty. They could be finding themselves in a position where there is a lack of support from friends, from family, from the system. They could already be in the position of where they're being groomed into either a gang for criminal exploitation, a terrorist gang, or for sexual exploitation. Their immigration status is a situational risk factor, because if this person is here as an illegal immigrant, these gangs will use this to exploit them. They will turn them into the authorities or threaten to turn them into the authorities if they do not carry out their willing. There is a lack of power. They feel that they do not have any control over their life or those around them. They may have poor language skills, so straight away they're vulnerable because they cannot communicate with the persons who are exploiting them. They may feel completely isolated. They may have been isolated by the community. This person may have been labelled by the community, maybe as a paedophile or as a drug dealer. This labelling of this person causes them to be isolated, increases their vulnerability. The coercive control that these people have over them, they do everything. They control their money, they control what they wear, they control what they eat, they control where they go, they control who they speak to. There's elements of family instability, including parental conflict. Homes where families are at constant conflict with each other, threatening divorce or arguing over money, and the children don't see any positive resolution to this. It's a vulnerability in their situation. And adverse community circumstances such as mass unemployment in the area, localised issues such as depravity, crime, racism. If you take the personal factors and you add them to the situational factors, there is a harm or risk of harm to that person, of becoming exploited for criminal purposes. So which of these vulnerabilities do you recognize? Because these harmed people harm people. Those who are committing the harm don't just get up in the morning and think, I'm going to go off and rob someone. This has happened over time. They themselves may well have been exploited. Now, this is not an excuse for criminal behaviour. That child there with a knife, that's a criminal activity. That's a robbery. That's still a criminal offence. But let's look into what's caused this. And so many times in the past, this has been ignored. Harmed people harm people. So, is he a criminal? Or is he a vulnerable victim? Now, as I said earlier on, that is still a robbery. That is still a criminal offence. But what's happening behind the scenes with this young male's life? What's going on behind the doors? What do we not see? This touches on the Jimmy Savile sexual offences scandal and how problematic victims were not believed by the police. It's about giving the victims a voice. In this particular case study, at least one vulnerable female has been used by a gang from London to sexually service its members and has been subjected to sexual violence. As a result of drugs debts, they attempted to kidnap her at least twice, and it's believed that they have also trafficked her to London in order to pay off a debt through prostitution. Now, if you think back to the reports of incidents in Rotherham where girls were going to the front counters of police stations and making complaints to the health services that they had been raped, these accounts were being ignored. These were vulnerable females who were being sexually assaulted and having sexual violence carried out on them. And as a result of the drugs debts, in some cases where they're being groomed to carry the drugs about for these gangs, they are then robbed by the same gang members of these drugs. So if they fear that their person that they're exploiting is going to leave the gang, they may have made noises to say that they wanted to leave, they'll have them robbed of their own drugs that they are moving about for them, in order to lock them in within the gang and say, you now owe us a debt and you will pay it back with interest. In this case, in order to pay this debt off, she was forced into prostitution. Could your child or young person be susceptible to exploitation? Do you have concerns that they are being exploited? Some signs for gang involvement and what to look out for, because involvement in gangs often leaves signs. A person may often leave signs whether they are an associate or a member of a gang. There could be a sudden change in lifestyle. They could suddenly find themselves a bit more affluent, coming with new clothing, new mobile phone, new trainers, where you've either refused to buy them for them and they have no money themselves that you're aware of to buy them. Now all of a sudden they're having these items bought for them. And these indicators could include persistently going missing from home, school, or being found out of their own areas. An unexpected acquisition of clothing, money, mobile phones, excessive texting, phone calls, or having multiple devices. They may have relationships with controlling older persons or groups, and you may find unexplained injuries or injuries where the explanation given by them doesn't quite add up. You yourself may already have concerns, or the parents and guardians that you may speak to have concerns. You may find yourself going through their clothing, their bags to clear out, maybe to wash, and you find weapons on them, in their pockets, in their bags. You may find yourself being called to the school because there's a significant decline in their results. And they have associations with gangs, or they may themselves be peer isolated. They don't hang around with people. This itself could be an exploitation area for them, a vulnerability that the gang members will exploit. There may be elements of self-harm or changes to emotional well-being because they desperately want to get themselves out of the situation. They may be using language that is completely out of character, sexual in nature, aggressive. And some highlighted risk factors of gang involvement, where there's the physical injury, the risk of serious violence and death, and the media have highlighted this in quite some detail, of shootings and stabbings. There's the emotional and psychological trauma, the sexual violence, be it sexual assault, rape, indecent images, being taken and shared as part of an initiation or revenge, or even a punishment. And these images are shared with other gang members and have spread across people's phones and their contacts lists. Internally inserting drugs known as plugging, which in itself brings a huge danger because if the packet ruptures, they could find themselves overdosing. A debt bondage. The young person and the families are being in debt to the exploiters, which is used to control the young person. And as I mentioned earlier on, some people are even robbed of the drugs or the cash that they are moving around for the gangs in order to lock them in within the gang. So they're stuck within this debt bondage and have to pay it off with interest. And this debt goes on and on and on. There may be neglect and their basic needs are not being met. So the gangs will use this to exploit it further, to say that your family, your friends don't want you, you're not even being fed properly, we will look after you. And this is where the chicken shops, and when they're being met down there, they'll pay for them to have their meal. And once they're locked in, they owe them a favour back. They may be living in unclean, dangerous or unhygienic environments. They have tiredness and sleep deprivation because the child is expected to carry out criminal activities over long periods and through the night. And therefore, they may end up with poor attendance and a attainment in a school, college or university. And the siblings of those involved in gangs have a higher risk of becoming involved themselves. And I'm very aware of one particular gang member. He left the gang. His brother was starting to become exploited by the gang and enticed in by them. Instead of the brother saying to his sibling, "This is the danger, I got myself away," he turned his back on them. Turned his back on his brother. His brother was then sucked further into the gang because they used it to exploit this further. They said, "Your brother doesn't want anything to do with you. Your brother is not your brother anymore. We are. And in fact, your brother is a traitor to us and you should have nothing to do with him." So, unfortunately, the sibling, thinking he was doing the right thing by turning his back on his brother, because he himself had got out of the gang and actually made it worse. Well, what is county lines and how are gangs involved? Well, the UK government defines county lines as a term used to describe gangs and organised criminal networks involved in exporting illegal drugs into one or more importing areas within the UK, using dedicated mobile phone lines or other form of a deal line. So these gangs will move out across from the cities into the suburbs, into the countryside in order to exploit these areas. And they are likely to exploit children and vulnerable adults to move and store drugs and money, and they will often use coercion, intimidation, violence, including sexual violence, and weapons. And county lines activity and the associated violence, drug dealing and exploitation has a devastating impact on young people, vulnerable adults and local communities. Rail network hubs such as Birmingham New Street, Clapham Junction, Manchester Piccadilly, St Pancras and Waterloo are key points of access to and exit from the rail network. However, it remains likely that other less obvious hubs are frequently used in county lines activity. The continued provision to British Transport Police of specific intelligence by local forces would lead to improved understanding of the rail network by both offenders and victims within the county lines activity. Between May and August 2018, 35% of suspects in county lines activity encountered on the rail network had links to possession of weapons within the previous 6 months, and 3% were linked to possession of firearms. This is evidence of the ongoing risk to both British Transport Police and members of the public who use the rail network that is frequented by county lines offenders. The national road network also remains key to the transportation of offenders, victims of exploitation, drugs, cash and weapons. Both hire and privately owned vehicles, including those owned by vulnerable adults, exploited in county lines activity, are used in transportation between and within supply areas. An emerging trend has been identified around the use of cloned number plates on private vehicles, which presents a challenge around the use of automatic number plate recognition. Offenders may also make use of minors who are not yet qualified to drive, encouraging them to operate vehicles illegally to facilitate the movement and supply of drugs. And the extent of use of taxis, minicabs, and private hire vehicles remains an intelligence gap. An emerging trend around the use of app-based taxi companies to transport both offenders and potential victims of exploitation to supply areas has also been identified. Contributory factors to county lines gang criminality. Saturation in inner city marketplaces has led to gangs operating beyond their own towns, cities, and counties, where less crowded places tend to be outside the big cities, and inner city children and young people are recruited to help set up drugs markets in provincial towns. Think of it as a business. If you own a small company or you make your own biscuits or cakes within your town or village and you want to extend this to other towns and other villages around the area because you've been hugely successful and you've saturated your town and you want to expand your business. Now, you have a couple of options. You can either move into the next town or village and undercut everybody that's there and sell your biscuits and product cheaper, or you can open up a franchise potentially using the local people in the area to do your business for you. This is essentially the same thing. The only difference is you're not using violence, where the gangs will use violence or threaten violence in order to force those within the less crowded places outside the inner city areas to help set up these drug markets in areas that were not tapped before. The county lines label. The term county lines is a relatively recent one that's been coined in order to label cross-county criminality, where in reality there always has been cross-border criminality in the UK, and communities which have been isolated in the past from county lines criminality are now finding themselves at the forefront as gangs exploit new untapped markets for drugs. For any Charles Dickens fans, Oliver Twist is a good example of county lines and gangs. Fagin, being the gang leader, is using Sykes to recruit with his gang of children to recruit new, vulnerable, open to exploitation children. And they exploit and recruit the vulnerable Oliver Twist into pickpocketing to fund their gang. And then he took it one step further. Bill Sykes used his girlfriend as a prostitute. So some statistics. 313,000 know a gang member. 60,000 gang members or siblings of gang members. 27,000 gang members. 6,560 identified gang members. 34,000 know a gang member and have been a victim of violence. 74% of police forces have reported an exploitation of vulnerable persons. 12% of policing regions reported exploitation of adults with physical disabilities. 61% of policing regions reported exploitation of drug users. 37% of policing regions reported exploitation of adults with mental health problems. 65% of policing regions reported exploitation of children. 26% of policing regions reported groups sexually abusing children. And these statistics come from the National Crime Agency in 2017. And these were last published data that could be found so far, so there's likelihood that there's been an increase. Can you afford not to act on your concerns? In this final case study, a 16-year-old male had been reported as missing from London and was considered at risk due to his age and links to gangs. He had recently failed to appear at court for his alleged involvement in a stabbing. He was found in possession of a 6-inch kitchen knife and 30 wraps of drugs. Whilst in custody, he was found to have significant burns to his body on his stomach area, consistent with having been burnt by boiling liquid. He would not disclose further details. However, it was suspected that these may have been caused by those responsible for placing him in Ipswich to deal in Class A drugs. So where to go for further help and advice? There's always the police. Telephone 101 or 999 if it's an emergency. Crime Stoppers, you can call anonymously with information about crime on 0800 555 111. Or there's the NSPCC. You can telephone on 0808 800 5000. And there are various other charities and organisations that are available to find on the internet that can assist you. Well, I hope you found this presentation informative and interesting, and we'll always be interested into hearing your feedback. So please, why not leave us a message on our SETS channel on YouTube. Thank you for listening. Advertise your business or services within our learning videos. Targeted advertising to our learners. Please contact our team for prices at info@solutionsequinox.com. Solutions Equinox Limited are able to provide clients with the following services: training consultancy services, learning material design and development, client-specific training programs, assessing services for levy apprenticeship programs, associate police trainer services, security cleared and police degree at BSc ONS qualified, internal quality assurance service, online learning programs, leadership and management, safeguarding, police recruitment training and business administration.